Midnight Encounter by Hugh is a thrilling hunting story of a leopard under the veil of darkness in the forest. Let's listen this story in the words of Hugh as well. It was a dark night, and only when the tail light of the bus was winking to a red pinpoint way up the road did I remember my torch on the front seat. I had just returned from Jabalpur a day earlier than Babs expected me, and when I got off at Matkili there was a 2-mile walk through the jungle to get home. When I set off it was just after 11 o'clock and there was no reason to expect anything else but a pleasant stroll through the dark night. The village street was deserted as most people were already in bed, but halfway down it I found Bihari loading his cart with grain for an early start to market. For a few minutes I stopped to chat, and when he knew that I was walking home without a light he offered me a lantern and an axe. I accepted both gratefully. A light would keep me to the track and the little jungle axes make comfortable walking sticks. Just beyond the village, the track wanders through fairly open country. When I was crossing this, the night was not too dark as the bright stars showed a few yards of the track ahead before it was bitten off by the night. But after I had gone a mile the black mass of the jungle loomed up against the dark sky, and when I came under the trees I could see nothing. The lantern was almost useless. It had probably never been cleaned in its life and the flickering flame was striving to show through a glass darkly. For a few hundred yards I trudged on with my footsteps a series of muffled crunches on the sandy track. Then I startled the first wild creature. From somewhere over to my right came the sharp alarm call of a barking deer, a warning taken up almost at once by a cheetal hind farther away. The behavior of wild animals always interests me, and so I stopped, wondering whether anything else would answer the cheetal. Nothing did, but the call of the barking deer came twice more, each time a little nearer than the first. I couldn't be sure, but that coming nearer suggested that something was wrong and that the deer was frightened of something more dangerous than I was. The wind said that, for it was blowing from behind me and almost straight to the deer. My scent must have been strong in its nostrils. Yet still it came on and called once more. I stood waiting and undecided. Deer sometimes seek the protection of man against the big cats, but there was something else I suspected as well. I stepped off the track and began tramping noisily through the fallen leaves and swinging the lantern high. When I had gone some 50 yards and the wind was full on my back and blowing straight towards where I judged the deer to be, I stopped. Then I gave a low whistle and the sharp bark of the mudjack. Nothing happened for 2 minutes, then, hesitantly, a faint rustling from not far away. Slowly the rustling came nearer, an animal tiptoeing through the leaves. For the last few paces it came with a rush and broke into the circle of light thrown by the lantern. A young barking deer, its horns just beginning to sprout. "What goes on, fathead?" I asked it. "Can't look after yourself even in your own jungles, eh?" This was Sammy, and we'd had him since he was a few hours old. The men who had brought him said that his mother had abandoned him in the jungle. That may or may not have been true. Those men were poachers, and it was more likely that Sammy's mother had disappeared into their cooking pots. Sammy, then, was the merest slip of a Disney fawn, all long spindly legs and soft fluffy ears. In spite of this, he thrived from the first day on a baby's bottle. He took to it like an experienced infant. And the only real difficulty we ever had about his meals was to persuade him that he had enough. For the first few months he was content to wander near the house, but as he grew older he started to roam farther afield. We seldom tried to restrain him unless we knew it was more unsafe than usual for him to be out. On this night when I met Sammy he had been wandering the jungles after dark for several months. By daybreak he was always back, usually bedded down somewhere near the front veranda preparing to sleep. However, the time now was just a few minutes to midnight and something on the prowl had obviously alarmed him as I was coming up. So, whether he liked the idea or not, the safest place for him was home. Sammy submitted meekly while I tied one end of a scarf round his neck, and when we set off to rejoin the track he trotted along quite willingly close to my side. We had gone perhaps 100 yards when he stopped suddenly and brought me up with a sharp tug on the scarf. As I could not pull him on without hurting his neck, I stepped back to shove him on from behind. When I touched him he was trembling, and he came in close to my knees, pressing hard against them. He kept his head high in the air while his dilated nostrils sniffed the wind and his eyes stared over to our left. I straightened up and began to listen. There was nothing but the cicadas and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. At last I managed to urge him on, but his gait now was like some crude marionette, jerky and stiff, his head held woodenly erect and still staring to the left. All at once I heard it, just the faintest rustle of dry leaves from behind us and to the left. Impossible to know what it was, and the only thing I could do was to go on pushing Sammy along the track towards home. I suspected a leopard, one of the bold ones not much scared of a light and thoroughly familiar with man. I raised the lantern as high as I could and waved it about. The rustling didn't come again and I went on pushing Sammy home. I was just thinking that Sammy's nose must have played him false when the most alarming noises broke out only a few yards to our left. With a sudden loud crashing, some large animal started to force a way through heavy brush. That lasted only a few seconds, and then whatever it was began to thresh madly about as though engaged in some high-spirited frolic. As the noise went on I realized what it was. Not a leopard but a bear, though what the fool was doing only another bear would know. But even with a bear it was safer to clear out fast. He's a jungle clod, far better left alone even when he seems on his best behavior. I lowered the lantern almost to the ground and tried to make Sammy quicken his pace. But he was still reluctant to move along the track and dug in his small pointed hooves as I shoved him on from behind. It was difficult to move him, and after some moments of hard shoving I was sweating and getting rather bad-tempered. All at once I stopped. Why waste so much energy? The leopard had turned out to be a bear, and even that, as far as I could tell now, had gone away. But even if it was still about, it would not hurt Sammy, and so he could be left to take his usual chance in the jungle. As I bent to untie the knot in the scarf, he was still trembling and every sinew under the twitching flesh was strung tight. I tried to calm him down, stroking his back and caressing his ears. He took no notice, his neck stayed stiff and he kept his eyes staring straight ahead. Then, without warning, he reared back and nearly jerked the scarf from my hand. A second later he yapped his sharp bark of alarm. Now he was tugging so violently that I was wrenched right round. For a few moments I fought him, then something made me turn my head and look over my shoulder. In the light of the lamp I saw a vague form lying across the track. It was only a few yards from us, and I whipped up the lantern to see it better. It was a leopard. Sammy saved us, for even as I stared the front paws teetered as it steadied to spring. Then the scarf snapped tight and I was wrenched back as the leopard left the ground. It is not easy to describe something that caught you unawares and then happened in the twinkling of an eye. But even though I had been pulled out of the way, my immediate impression was that the leopard had missed us deliberately. Stranger still, when the leopard hit the ground he seemed to have lost control and hurtled out of the light in a great burst of sand and flying leaves. The next instant that mad threshing started again. It was as though the leopard had been gripped by some terrible anger and was tearing wildly at everything within reach. Those furious sounds were now coming from behind us, and they suddenly goaded Sammy to life. All at once he was off, racing for home as fast as his legs could carry him. So was I. The end of the scarf was still in my hand, and it seemed the best idea in the world to be flying from that crazy brute in the bushes. Only when we came to our long drive at the end of the jungle did we slacken speed. Then, panting for breath, we went more slowly until we reached the house. Once there, I took Sammy across to the cowsheds and bundled him in with the calves. He went willingly, with none of the prancing nonsense he usually put on whenever we shut him up for his own good. While Babs boiled some coffee and made sandwiches, I was thinking about that curious leopard. I was still shaken, but the more I thought about what had happened, the more I realized how very odd the whole incident had been. It was altogether too odd to be dismissed as just a lucky escape. Something was wrong, and so wrong that it could not be left as it was, because strange happenings like this often lead to trouble. At that moment I could think of no explanation to fit all the facts. Indeed, the only thing I was sure of was that leopards just do not behave as the one we had recently met, and to have seen it at all was perhaps the most perplexing aspect of the whole affair. As a general rule, the leopard wears an invisible cloak, an annoying fact that accounts for a great deal of its success. By the time the coffee and sandwiches were finished, I had decided to go out again. I changed into a pair of light rubber shoes and put new batteries in the spare torch and into the one mounted on a rifle, in case these preparations should give the idea that I was solemnly setting out to stalk a leopard through a black jungle strewn with crackling leaves. Let me add quickly that that was not my intention at all. The theory I had formed by now was that this leopard was dangerous because it was desperate. It had probably been wounded, and on account of that was so hungry that it was prepared to take risks to get a meal. If that was true, there was a fair chance that it was still about, and if it was and still making all that noise, it should be possible to locate it before it found me. That's not so brave as it sounds. This time I should be accompanied by the 3 dogs, and not by a frightened deer. These were odds no leopard would ever take on. If it found us first, there was no doubt it would bow to a superior force and make off. We set off briskly along the drive. When we came to the end of it, we slowed, and 100 yards into the jungle beyond we stopped to listen. We were showing no lights, so the blackness around was intense and alive with the noise of millions of insects. Somewhere to our left I heard monkeys in a tree. Their sentinels had seen us and made us out for what we were. Now they were passing us on as friends to their brothers round about by rustling the branches. They had a message for us, too. The leopard was not near us, and so we could go on slowly towards where I had left him. Our eyes were getting more used to the darkness. Now, for a few yards ahead, the track was dimly visible, and on each side of it the faint outlines of trees. On the soft sand, trodden free of dead leaves, we were creeping along without a sound. After 10 minutes we stopped to listen again. There was nothing to hear, and this time there were no monkeys near us. That was a pity, as we were getting close to the scene of my recent encounter. After another 50 yards I stopped suddenly when a sound ahead caught my ears. It had come from not far away and to our left, and, from the sounds that had followed the first, there was little doubt that we had found the leopard. But the noise it was making now was more puzzling than ever. That mad threshing had stopped, and in its place was a light muffled thumping with an irregular rhythm. As I listened, I knew that the unlikely had happened. We had found the leopard first, and he still knew nothing about us. Once more, we crept quietly forward. A few steps now would bring us into the ideal night range of about 40 yards. At my heels I could sense the excitement mounting in the dogs. They could scent the quarry for what it was and were waiting eagerly for the shot. Soon we were as close as I thought we could safely get, but before switching on the torch I tried to place the leopard exactly by the noise it was making. In front of me I could see the black mass of some bushes, and if the noise was an indication the leopard was under them. I raised the rifle and pressed the switch on the torch. The light blazed and lit up a large clump of thorns. It was much denser than I expected, and there was no sign of the leopard. I kept the torch on and played the beam quickly over the thorns. All the time I was expecting the leopard to take some violent action. But nothing happened. The leopard took not the slightest notice of the light and just went on with that thump. 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 The noise was so near that we seemed to be standing on top of it. Where the devil was it coming from? I played the light over the thorns again, this time more slowly. Something moved on the far side. The beam flicked back and held it. A leafy shoot was jerking to the same erratic rhythm as that strange thumping. I kept the light on it and tried to see through the thorns. They were too dense and a mass of winking pinpoints of reflected light, but the leopard was certainly on the ground at the back of them. How to get round to it? That the blaze from the torch had not so far worried it was not unusual, as leopards will often stand some time staring at a light. But the slightest sound would arouse it at once, and to work to the back of the thorns meant leaving the silence of the sandy track for the hazards of leaf and twig-strewn ground. Somehow we did it, with a luck that seemed miraculous. The light had to be kept on, for without it we should never have picked our way. But time and again as we inched round we made small noises, which the leopard must not heard. Yet it never moved, except to keep up that irregular thumping. The leopard came into the light, suddenly. Its head was resting between its outstretched paws, and pointing away from us as it lay on the ground. I put the foresight on the back of its neck and then edged nearer until its whole body came into view. My finger tightened on the trigger, and then I hesitated. What kind of a leopard was this? During the better part of 15 minutes a bright light had been playing about the thorns. Now the light was shining straight at it, and I didn't believe that it had not heard our approach. Some strange fascination held me rooted and kept me staring at its spotted body. The leopard had dragged itself straight through the thorns. Some of the long leafy trailers loaded with claws were wound tightly round one of its hind legs. And now I could see the cause of that thumping. It was the leopard's tail, which was hopelessly tangled in a mass of twisted tendrils. It was flicking up and down, but the movements were so listless that it seemed as though the leopard had long since given up hope of wrenching free. The leopard still had not looked round. It was uncanny, for as we peered round the edge of the thorns, we were only 20 paces away. Then, almost as if it had read my thoughts, the leopard stirred. With a movement that seemed lazy, it slowly raised its head from between its paws. My finger tightened on the trigger again, even though I felt sure that the leopard was still making no move to spring up. Very gently the head shakes from side to side, then turns towards us. The shock was sudden and complete. I had been ready to see the blazing eyes and snarling mouth of a leopard when it looked into the light, but there were no eyes and no mouth. I caught my breath as the hideous mask turned full towards me. It was a featureless blank of an unearthly dull brown. I stared at it with a wave of horror surging through me. The thing on the ground seemed to be some multiversant devil of the forest in animal guise. Without realizing that I had squeezed the trigger, I saw the horror in front of me leap to the shock of the bullet. While its legs were still kicking in the air, I put in another shot and it lay quiet. Now I had to turn to control the dogs, before they raced forward. When I looked again, the leopard's breathing had stopped. Slowly I went up to it and, with the muzzle an inch from its neck, trod on the end of its tail. Devil or not, there was no longer any life in its body. I walked up to its head and looked down at the mask. For a few moments I was puzzled until I bent closer. Poor devil. It seemed to have taken nearly every pellet from a birdshot cartridge full in the face. Both eyes had been put out, and it was the second of 3 animals I have found blinded by criminally careless shooting. I believe,